Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. Can you hear me properly? Oh gosh, can you hear me? Yes. Good morning. I just want to really thank you for making the effort to come today because I know you have competing priorities, and we are really privileged that you would spend or choose to spend this time with us this morning. At the head table, let me acknowledge Governor Dr. Alvin Hilaire and our manager of the research department, Mr. Garnet Samuel, in case you don't know him. And this morning's format is simple. Governor will make a presentation he will present the monetary policy report for 2017, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. And Garnet is here, who he will be very, very able to provide support to him in responding. Just a couple of things. I know it's Christmas. I just want to tell you all and your families that we wish you the very best for this beautiful season. After the session, we'll invite you to refreshments through that door, but you know the drill. I would like to welcome the public because they have joined us via live stream. And without any more hesitation and delay, please welcome the governor to the podium. Warmly welcome him to the podium. Media, thank you for turning up this morning.
Thank you, Nicole. Welcome to the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago on this beautiful Thursday morning. I hope you had a good breakfast and that you're ready to engage with us today. What we are trying to do today is to modify the presentation somewhat. So I'll make a fairly short presentation that will look at monetary policy in general, and at some point, maybe midway, look at what is happening in the economy. And then hopefully we'll have a set of rich discussions afterwards. So without further ado, let me start. Monetary policy in Trinidad and Tobago, how it stacks up to other central banks. Now, central banks worldwide are making increasing efforts to lift the veil of mystery that has traditionally enveloped the world of monetary policy. So you are saying, well, I don't know much about the central bank. I know my coins, I know my notes, but what really does the central bank do? What is this monetary policy thing about? And for most people, their eyes sort of glaze over when they hear all these esoteric concepts of monetary aggregates, interest parity, transmission mechanisms, etc. And so there's a large degree of mystery surrounding it. So this is what we want to try to talk about today. What people can relate to, however, is the changing value of their money. You have $1, you have $100, and you say, wait, I could have bought some KFC, a 5-piece with $25. Now I could only buy a 2-piece or something, or just after a little while, just the fries. So you can relate to that. So this would be you will get the slides afterwards, and you would get the actual speech. So don't worry about this. This is just the main points that you could look at your leisure. So I'm assured by 10:30, the PowerPoint presentation, the speech, and the MPR itself would be on the website. So you could take a look at it. So welcome to the wonderful world of monetary policy. We see things sometimes, you say, well, what's going on here? You have things going up and down. You have interest rates. You have exchange rates. You have monetary aggregates. You have yen. You have euros. You have equations involving a whole set of things. So this is what we consider a wonderful world that we want to share with you today. And hopefully you will be convinced afterwards. Now, in the early days of central banking, it was actually seen as a virtue for governors to communicate very little on what they were doing for fear that the public might misinterpret it, and this could actually destabilize the financial markets. Even when they communicated, efforts would be made to be as vague as possible. So consider, for example, Mr. Alan Greenspan, who some of you would know is federal chairman from 1987 to 2006. And he was a master at what he called Fed speak. And to Congress one time, he told a congressman, if I turn out to be particularly clear, you've probably misunderstood what I've said. So there's a whole mystery, a whole aura, a whole invincibility of this pristine world of central banking and monetary policy. And so it was actually a virtue to be like that. But things are changing over time. And there's a realization now that communication could actually make monetary policy more effective because people will understand what is happening and people will be able to react in an informed fashion. It does take some courage, it does take some risk, but it is important. And I think this is the growing realization that we have now. For example, we have in the US, we have some attempts at forward guidance, in other words, what is going to happen. At the European Central Bank, they had a conference sometime recently on central bank communication, talking about this whole issue. At the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, we are also very excited about communicating our policies more clearly and meaningfully and in simple language to the public. So it is a work in progress, but we have committed to it in our strategic plan, and I would urge you, if you have the time, to look at our website, see our strategic plan, give us comments on it, and see if it makes sense to you. So today this presentation today is an effort to actually lift the shroud of this and to discuss some of the things that we are working with now. Some of the institutions that are at the forefront of this new excitement about communication include the Fed, the European Central Bank, the Norges banks, and the Swedish Central Bank. I can't pronounce it in Swedish. So we'll focus on monetary policy today. At some other time, when we meet, we talk about financial stability. Now, what are the goals of monetary policy? Well, a clear one, as I had alluded to before, is inflation control, the value of your dollar, your dollars, your cents, and so forth. But it is not that simple because over time, things have changed. And across different countries, things are different. So a central bank may have the goals of inflation generally, but in some legislations, you actually have economic growth, economic development, employment, the value of the currency, and so forth. So sometimes it may seem obvious, but when you put all these things together, things could get very complicated. And so some objectives may actually conflict with other objectives. Now, if you look at a paper by the Bank for International Settlements in a couple of years ago, they looked at different phases in the world. So you had a Victorian era from 1840s to 1914, the decades of government control, 1930s to 1960s, the triumph of the markets, 1980 to 2007. You don't need to remember all of this thing, but just that's the idea that central banks went through different waves of understanding what they're doing and focusing on different objectives. Of course, with the international financial crisis of 2008, 2009, there was a huge set of interest in what central banks were doing. First, because people were thinking that they were sleeping at the wheel and were responsible for the problems. And secondly, that they were tasked with solving the problems. And thirdly, the way that they went about it was very unconventional. So you had this massive asset purchase program and so forth. So all of this by the US and different countries. So all of this focused more attention on governance of central banks, of transparency, of communication, and of public accountability. So this is part of the wave that is moving us in this direction that we are part of. Now, just to talk a bit about the different goals, if you look at the US Fed, their goals are actually stipulated in legislation as maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. So you have a range of things that they have to do simultaneously. Now, recently, some central banks, not that recent, but you have a different set of rhythms for this. But there has been a large focus of central banks to cut to the core of what they were supposed to be doing. And this is inflation control. So they call themselves inflation targeters, and they set concrete goals, sometimes that is very widely announced, and also a specific timetable for announcing how they are progressing, what they are doing, and that they would be accountable for it. So sometimes the governor could actually be fired for not making the goals, as in New Zealand. Some of these countries include Canada, Colombia, Mexico, and New Zealand. Now, what is this, or what relevance is this to Trinidad and Tobago? When we look at the Central Bank Act, because we have to be governed by legislation, our act states that there are a number of goals for our central bank, including to maintain the monetary stability, control, and protect the external value of the monetary unit, but also to encourage expansion in the general level of production, trade, and employment. So it's a huge task that we have to be aware of and to do. So let's go now, since we've narrowed this to Trinidad and Tobago, let's see what is the context for monetary policy that we are operating with. Clearly, a big part of it is the nature of our economy. We are an oil exporter, and that brings in train a lot of things. It means that the energy sector is dominant. Most of the way this comes to the economy is through government taxes on the energy sector or through the balance of payments. And this has clear implications for monetary policy and macroeconomic policy in general. One aspect of it is clearly the dependence of energy and our being subject to the potential vicissitudes of international energy prices. So we do have boom-bust cycles that we are very familiar with. Of course, now, if I turn it to what we were just talking about, inflation and growth, we see that because of this dynamic, we do have a situation where monetary policy has to contend with. So, for example, in the graph, what we try to do is just simply to look at from 1969 to 2017, what was the pattern of growth and what was the pattern of inflation. We do notice, and the orange line or brown line at the top, the dashed line shows 10%, and if we consider anything above 10% as high inflation, generally over that period, long span of history, we have fairly moderate inflation, but the high inflation points coincided with the economic boom arising from the oil price hike in 73. So you see one episode of that. You see other episodes where you have more moderate inflation but high growth, which is around 95, 97, etc., to about 2007 or so. And then you see a period in between where you had low growth accompanied by low or moderate inflation. So the central bank now has to take all of that into account when it is doing its policies. Another important consideration is the exchange rate regime, and the economists among you would be familiar with that. So Trinidad and Tobago switched from a fixed exchange rate in 1993 to a completely floating exchange with no controls on the current account or the capital account. What does this mean? It means that for monetary policy now, any action we take, we have to take into account the external environment because we are not, as it were, insulated by controls on capital and so forth. Simply put, it means that if monetary action leads to some change in interest rates, let's say, it would affect the relative price or the relative interest rate between Trinidad and Tobago and another country, and this could then lead to capital moving in and out. I try to simplify what sometimes seems a very complex thing, but in essence, it is fairly straightforward. Monetary policy now has to take into account the external dimension. The economists like complications, so sometimes they find jazzy words for this. They call the impossible trinity, where you have the difficulty of having an independent monetary policy with no capital controls, as well as a managed exchange rate. So if you have the time and you have nothing else to do, you could read up about this. You'll see the literature. I cited some of the literature. But the main simple fact is that we have now to take that clearly into account. Now, in adapting over time, the central bank has moved progressively towards more market-determined policy instruments. I wouldn't take a lot of time on this, but what it means is that when we do policy, initially we started off in 1964, we had a range of what we call direct controls. We have, for the most part, reserve requirements, which requires commercial banks to put some money in the central bank. And then you could modify that if you want to, let's say, contract monetary policy. You tell them, well, put more. And then, well, because they put more, they have less, and then interest rates could go up and so forth. And then we also had something like what we call selective credit controls. So, for example, the bank is saying, well, we don't want credit for, I don't know, for tables to grow too much. So we tell the banks, cut the credit to the table manufacturers. So this is what you call selective credit controls. Now, over time, and since the 2000s, we have actually been moving away from that substantially towards more indirect instruments of monetary policy. Why is this? Clearly, there was a realization globally that this could be potentially more efficient. Then we also had a more sophisticated capital and other financial markets growing over time, so that this would then be possible. What does this mean? It means that the central bank would then be able to influence through, let's say, persuasive measures or incentives the markets to behave in a certain way. Two things come to mind. Our open market operations, where we buy and sell securities in the market, and by buying, we could actually, either in buying and selling, we actually increase or lower interest rates, so that would be then spilling over to the market. The other thing is what we call our repo rate, which broadly speaking represents the rate at which commercial banks, if they have a real difficulty, could borrow from the central bank. What it means is this represents an opportunity cost, as it were, for the commercial banks to get financing from the central bank. And so the idea is that if we raise or lower this rate, then the banks would say, well, okay, my potential cost of funds is going up or down, so I would need to transmit that to my clients. So simply speaking, if we either change our open market operations stance or our repo rate, then this will spill over into the rest of the economy, and therefore our objectives would be served. But of course, sometimes we have to, to be careful, because, let me use this, go on to this thing. For those of you who are familiar with vehicles, this is supposed to be a transmission mechanism. They told me that's what it is. I just have to believe them. But what it means is that our reliance on indirect market instruments requires a lot of sophistication, maneuvering, understanding, dynamism, and responsiveness. Why? Because we are relying on the market to do things. And so, the first of all is the transmission mechanism. I said simply that we change the repo and things happen. Well, it's not that simple in practice, because the banks have to respond in a certain way. Similarly, if we buy or sell securities, they have to respond, but they may not respond. For example, they may say, well, I don't need your securities, or I am not borrowing from the central bank, so I don't need to be worried about the repo rate. So a situation where you have what you call a high excess liquidity could be at the heart of some of the ways where our policies could be difficult to get into the economy. What do I mean? If banks have a lot of cash available, then they don't need necessarily to borrow from the central bank, or they may not need to sell securities and so forth. So all of this is just to say that we have to be, and that is what we have been doing over the years, beefing up our understanding of the market, talking to the commercial banks all of the time, discussing with the government how it is doing its financing programs and so forth. And we have to get all of this together and model this to be able to work with our new tools. One of the things that I just wanted to touch on here, and I'm sure we'll discuss it some other time, is digital currencies. We all know that these things are probably going to be with us in the very near future. Some of it is already here. But that could complicate life. Well, complicated in the sense that now we have another thing to think about. What exactly is your definition of money? What is our definition of credit? What is our definition of interest rates or the cost of financing and all of that? So this is not a trivial matter, and we are prepared for this at the central bank. We've already started to discuss it. I'll be going to the Bahamas next week at the governors' meeting, and this is one of the topics for discussion. And next year we'll be having a seminar on this thing because we need to be prepared. But the basics is that our transmission mechanism, we need to be very savvy on understanding it, but it could become more difficult to understand over time. Now let's get into what may be more interesting for you all at this stage. Where are we now on the economic front? I wouldn't spend too much time going into the details. Some of it you would know already. You would have had the recent budget. You would have seen different commentators and so on. You may have the statistics. But I want to just give a flavor of how we see it at the central bank and some of the basic things that are going on. Clearly, we know that international energy prices have remained at a new low. We had over $100 some time ago. Now it is more the norm for 50s and so forth. We have recently, I think yesterday or so, it inched up past 60, so that's potentially important news and could provide some space. But the fact is that we have to be concerned about that, or we have to be sensitive to it. It is becoming a bit more complicated to even figure out what is going to happen in the future, because we have a situation where shale oil is coming into the picture. A lot of countries are moving towards or away from fossil fuels and so forth. So all of this means that the shock could actually be permanent. And this is something that we need to take into account when we decide how to do monetary and other policies. The second issue, as you well know, energy sector production. We've had some declines over the years. The good news is that we've seen some recovery in the second half of this year so far. In the third quarter, the numbers are looking fairly positive. Natural gas, oil, and so forth. So this augurs well for the future, but again, let's see how sustainable that is. But it has, combined with the low oil prices, created problems, certainly for the fiscal side, which is the last graph. And the Minister of Finance would have gone through all the details, but clearly you know that we have a fiscal balance that has weakened, and fiscal consolidation is underway. And the difficulty is working out the timing of it, and also the fact that it could be constraining for growth in the short run, especially if you have capital expenditure that has to be restrained. So let's see how that goes. But this is part of the backdrop. And clearly you would see from the dark brown lines on the right side that in 2016 we had a major contraction, about 6% real growth, real contraction in GDP, so this is substantial. This year, the CSO projects minus 2.3%. That was before the second half numbers came out, so it could be somewhat better than that. But still, we are in a situation where, because of dominance of the energy sector, this determines the whole pattern of our economy. There's a few other slides now on where we are. Reserves and the exchange rate, we all are aware of the numbers on the international reserves. At some point in 2014, they were probably over a year's worth of imports. Now they're about 9-point-something months of prospective imports. We've had some currency movement more in 2016. And so that is an important thing to remember. Well, I'll summarize the whole flavor of it afterwards. Clearly, we know that this was associated with a weakening in the external current account, which just means how much we buy from abroad relative to how much we sell abroad on a regular basis. That's what we call the current account, from surplus to to negative afterwards. Interestingly, however, we have on the inflationary front, inflation has been very low, on the order of, I think the last number is 1.2%, 1.2%, something like that. And food inflation was about 1.8, and then core inflation was even lower, 1.1 or something percent. So we haven't had an inflationary problem of late, of the last few months, or even for a year or so. And even if you look up to January 2016, the highest it went was probably 3 point something percent. So this is important to keep in mind, and interest rates have been steady. So what is the upshot of all this now? Because I've painted a picture where we have the fiscal issues, where we have the balance of payments issues, where we have low inflation, where we have growth situation, and we have the external configuration of oil prices is somewhat unsteady, because we have a leveling off at around 50, we have it peaking a little above that, but we don't know the future. What does all this mean? It means that we are still in the early stages, as we at the central bank considered, of a major adjustment to a potentially permanent shift in the terms of trade. So this is important to know, because how we deal with permanence of the shock and how we deal with monetary and fiscal policies all come together in that regard. So meanwhile, the short-term prospects for non-energy exporters are looking very good. The latest IMF report shows that the world economy is actually expected to continue its recovery, and the recovery is strengthening. So this is very good news, and potentially for our exports from Trinidad and Tobago. Petroleum exports and energy exports potentially, and non-energy exports also potentially. I say potentially because, of course, as I mentioned before, you have the issue of shale oil and gas, and then the move away from fossil fuels, so that could be something affecting secular demand. And then also, depending on competition from other sources, that would determine whether our exports actually respond. But this is good news that we need to take into account, particularly for the non-energy exporters. So this is the panorama. But of course, we have another thing to take into account, which I had alluded to before, where we have an open capital account and so forth. We have to look at what is happening with global interest rates. The Federal Reserve, they have been on a tightening policy. They've leveled off somewhat, but there is broad consensus. And if you look at the graph to your right, you will see the expectations for a rate hike. I think the black one is the latest one, September 15th, that everyone sees that rates would likely go up in 2018, 19, etc. It may come sooner rather than later, but that is the general consensus, because this is bolstered by news that the economy is strengthening in the U.S., unemployment is not increasing, and inflation is not a problem so far. So that is a very important thing for us to keep in mind when we determine the stance of monetary policy. The interest rates rise potentially in the U.S. And this is something that a lot of other emerging markets would be taken into account. How does an interest rate rise in the U.S. and elsewhere potentially affect their potential for capital movement? So I like this graph in particular. I hope you don't get too mesmerized by it. But in this context, monetary policy in Trinidad and Tobago is simultaneously aiming to keep inflation low while facilitating economic recovery and maintaining external balance. So I come back to the point that I've been making before, and I try to make it as clear as possible, that central banks have different objectives. Inflation control one, yes, but they generally have other things to take into account. In our legislation, we have growth and all this thing, furthermore, we are looking at an external environment that we have to be aware of. What does this mean? It means that at the central bank, we are constantly throwing up the balls, juggling it, and trying to see what should we aim at. To be specific, we have decisions to make. Should we lower the repo? Should we increase the repo? Should we keep it stable? What do we do? Well, there are arguments on both sides. Let's say lowering interest rates. Lowering interest rates potentially has a positive impact because it could help stimulate much needed growth in the economy through the credit channel. In other words, if interest rates go down, potentially businesses could borrow. And just as an aside on that, what we've noticed is that over the last couple of years, credit growth has actually been very, very anemic, particularly for businesses. I think the last number we have is 1.4%, I believe, year-on-year growth. This is very small. The numbers that are more buoyant would be credit for mortgages and to some extent for consumers, particularly credit card usage. And so we have to look at that, but potentially that interest rates lower interest rates could do that. But of course, when we look at what I just described about the US and other economies, then this could actually worsen the interest differential relative to abroad. And this could, again, lead to portfolio outflow. So this is something we have to always be juggling. And of course, now, if we focus on the external side, we could say, all right, let's raise interest rates so that we keep a decent differential with the foreign rates. But then what that does now, it could potentially harm growth. So in this context, we have balanced it by keeping a neutral policy stance. Now, let me go into the topic to try to bring things back to the topic that I started off with. How does our monetary policy stack up with other central banks? I've painted a picture where we looked at the different objectives, where we looked at different constraints and so forth. So what does all this mean? Let's look at on the right side, you have some countries here, we have some data, and we have the monetary policy stances on the right. I just explained to you how in Trinidad and Tobago we have a fairly neutral policy stance at this point in time. But there is quite a bit of heterogeneity in how central banks are conducting their policies. So although they generally have a philosophy that is similar by looking at their objectives seriously and so forth, depending on their particular country circumstances, the actual policies could differ. So in the US, as I mentioned before, they're on a tightening path because of the growth and the good news on that, so forth. The UK is also moving in that direction. In the Euro area, it is more complex because here they have a number of different members and they have different things going on at the same time. Some still have high debt. And so they have decided to keep a more or less open mind as to what to do. And so their policy stance has been fairly neutral. But they are poised to go in either direction, depending on what is going to happen. Similarly, Japan is concerned about their growth, so they keep that stance there. In the rest of the Latin America and the Caribbean, it's quite interesting because you see Colombia and Brazil recently reduced their representative interest rates because they are concerned about the economic growth. So they have reduced their thing, but they have complemented it by other policies. So the main point of all this thing is that you could have different results even if you have the same overall philosophy. So let me go into to wrap up as to what does all this mean and could we get as a central bank and what are some of the main lessons that other central banks, as well as the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, would be drawing from this recent experience. The first is, and I would highlight three of them. The first is that for successful macroeconomic adjustment, there must be effective policy coordination. Now, it is well known that if you have something to do, sometimes you have a number of considerations to take into account. Let me use a practical example. We get into the end of the year, New Year's resolutions coming up. I don't have to tell you what most people's resolution is. I'll tell you in a little, but you'll figure it out and I'm sure we'll come to the same conclusion. And then also we have Carnival coming up. So guess what? People say, well, I need to lose 50 pounds or whatever. All right. Well, you could go to the gym every day. You have, a rigorous exercise regime. And you say, all right, well, that will do it. But any dessert pass, you're taking part of it. Anything, so you start a binge on stuff because, well, it's Christmas, this thing. It won't work. You have to balance different things. So just like a practical example that we can all relate to, you want to lose some weight, you have to balance the exercise with the dieting. It is simple. You could translate it simply to the macroeconomic front. You have to have a combination of policies for successful macroeconomic adjustment to work. Monetary policy, as I said, can do certain things, but it cannot do it in isolation. Let me give you an example. If, let's say, the central bank wants to reduce interest rates to stimulate the economy, as I said before, but at the same time, you have, on the fiscal side, you have a lot of government borrowing, then that could stymie that because then interest rates may not be allowed to go up because of the financing requirements of the government. So that is the fiscal side that could constrain monetary measure. Let's say the structural side now. The central bank tries to reduce interest rates, but guess what? The commercial banks may want to reduce their rates, but the private sector may say, well, I don't want to borrow because what's the point? There's not, the economic outlook may be fragile. Also, I may have difficulty in being able to do any projects. It is too difficult. The ease of doing business is low. A lot of bureaucracy, red tape, I can't move things around and so forth. So you have to have a combination of all three, fiscal, monetary, and structural adjustment at the same time, well coordinated for this to work in a successful fashion and in a durable fashion. So just to talk about in Trinidad and Tobago on the structural front, because we talked about the monetary side and the fiscal side already. I certainly believe, and I think at the central bank we generally have that view, that there's a lot of rich dividends that could be reaped from structural reforms, meaning that to change the way of actually doing business. And a lot of this may need to be via legislative reform, institutional change, what we task our institutions to do and hold them accountable, attitudes, what do we towards competitiveness, to doing things the right way and so forth. Technology, embracing what is new, not just using the past, but embracing the technological developments, the ways of doing business. Modernization of standards, making sure that we adapt and we set ourselves high international standards, improve competitiveness, and strengthen accountability so people know that when they are doing a job, they are accountable for things. So the simple point I want to make here, and this is what the central banks across the world have come to the realization, along with other policymakers, is that you have to have coordinated policy for successful adjustment. The second point I want to make is constant attention must always be paid to avoiding excessive central bank financing of governments, given the implications for inflation. Now, of course, one of the objectives of a central bank in most places is to be banker to the government. And you may say, well, all right, well, doesn't a banker grant credit? Okay. But the central bank is in a very unique role because central banks have the capacity to what you call create money. And if you have too much monetary expansion, then that creates the potential for high inflation. So this is where you would find a lot of central bankers are always worried about fiscal deficits. So in the speech, you would see there are references to some works that you could check on this. Now, the ability of a central bank to lend to a government differs among countries. Some countries actually prohibit it by law. And they say, I think if I have it correctly, Chile, Peru, and Poland. Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Poland. Lending to the government is precluded by the Constitution. In other countries, a limit may be specified in law. Right? In Trinidad and Tobago, the legal limit is 15% of estimated government revenue with the proviso that this be repaid as soon as possible. So this is how we have it in our country. So this is just to give you something that central bankers would be aware of. Let me just step back a bit on the structural side. I wanted to give another example of reform using the case of Latin America and compared to Asia. And some recent work by the IMF had highlighted this situation, where some countries had opted to have deep exchange rate moves in Latin America. So you had a big devaluation or whatever. And the result was that it did equilibrate the external situation. So things came into balance on the external front. But the examination of the evidence showed that a lot of this came about because of import compression. So in other words, you get balance in the external accounts, but at the expense of imports. Imports were contracted violently, where exports didn't respond as much. And this is something very interesting, and it was exercising the minds of the policymakers. They say, well, maybe that's not what we want. But again, the structural aspect comes into play, because the same thing you do in Asia, you have a huge export response. But why? Why is this? Because of potential rigidities in some markets. So in some areas, as I was talking about, and in some Latin American countries, it was difficult to get new workers. It was difficult to get technology going. It was too difficult to get anything done. You know, the ease of doing business was so difficult. Businesses were sluggish, so they couldn't respond. So the lag response was so long that import compression was the order of the day. Whereas in Asia, it's quite different. In some countries, you have the slightest price advantage. I mean, the toys come out the shelves. You know, people, they ramp up production overnight because they are geared up, prepared for this thing. So I just wanted to give that example to emphasize again the structural component of adjustment. So let me go on to the last point, and I talked about this already. The last point I wanted to make here is that it is better for macroeconomic adjustments to be made from a position of strength. And I would just relate it to Trinidad and Tobago, which we are more concerned about, is that we are still in a relatively strong position. We have, and let me just go back, that when we had this change in the price of oil and natural gas, we started off in a stronger position than, let's say, previous episodes when we didn't have that much reserves and so forth. So we started from a position there. We also have started from a position much stronger than other countries. Three clear expressions of our buffers would be our high international reserves, our substantial deposits in a heritage and stabilization fund, and our relatively low level of public debt. So you start off with a good position. This has allowed us to have a relatively measured approach to adjustment. The point is that over time, the degrees of freedom would be reduced, and this could have an effect on perceptions, financial markets, and so forth. So we have to be aware of that. And so what I just want to say is that we are still in a very strong position, but attention must be taken to engender the necessary reforms in a context of fiscal, structural, and monetary policy coordination as soon as possible. I've talked a long while, so let me just finish with looking forward. Looking forward, monetary policy in Trinidad and Tobago will need to maintain its dynamism to deal not only with current but future domestic and external financial challenges. And if I'm to summarize all what I've said before, and Trinidad and Tobago's central bank relative to the rest of the central banks, the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago joins the fraternity of central banks across the world in pursuing a monetary policy appropriate to country-specific circumstances, while advocating for close coordination with other macroeconomic policies sooner rather than later, and avoiding excessive monetary creation. The bank is also aiming to simplify its public communication in our operation and in our financial literacy program more generally. We are still working through the arguments pro and con for providing forward guidance, so be patient with us on that. And we anticipate that despite some bright spots on the horizon, 2018 will present future or further challenges for macroeconomic management, including monetary policies. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Governor. I really hope that you found the presentation enlightening. I know I will remember the structural adjustment example. Thanks for that, Governor. We would like to open the floor for your questions, and there are microphones positioned that you can, yeah? You have one. Oh, gosh, goodness. Welcome. All right.
Good morning.
Your pen?
All right. Yeah, Governor, you talked about the numbers, but one of the things that you didn't include was the number that's in the report, where it showed that over 9 months of January to September 2017, there was $1 billion in reduction in the country's international reserves, which is about 10.5% of total reserve position. And coupled with the bank's payment challenges and the external account, do you think, how long do you think the country can continue in this way without there being a devaluation of the currency? And secondly, in that context, would you say that Trinidad and Tobago is more in line with the Latin American model you talked about, or the Asian model? And if that is in fact impacting the decision or the decisions of the central bank, re-depreciation of the TT dollar? And if I could make a final question in relation to energy prices, and production, most of the data seem to suggest that the country may come out of the shortage of supply on the natural gas side about 2019, 2020. So therefore, do you expect the foreign reserve situation to continue to be hamstrung by that up until 2020? And how is that going to impact monetary policy, the depreciation of the currency?
Yes, thank you for your question. On the reserves, I thought I did. Maybe I didn't go into detail this year, but yeah, it is clear. What I talked about was a reduction from over 12 months to 9 months. But yes, this is something that we are looking at very carefully. And just to put it in broad context, at the central bank, when we look at intervention, because this is the other aspect of it. What does the central bank sell to the public? We look at it, we take into account a number of things. The potential inflows and outflows of foreign currency, the level of reserves, market behavior, and action on all different fronts. So yes, we are aware clearly of the reserve situation. Related to that, you say how long it will continue? Well, as I said, and I want to emphasize this really, it requires coordinated policies. And your question is really at the heart of two of the points that I was making on policy coordination and timing. Because we do have a situation where we are still, by any standard, any global standard, a high reserves country. But of course, as I said, the degrees of freedom could be eroded over time, and this could affect financial markets. So we have to balance all these considerations. And the other point I made is about coordinating fiscal, monetary, and structural policies. So I can't give you an answer in isolation with all of these things happening, but this is what we certainly look at the central bank. In terms of the second question, I think we are more in the Latin American, and some of the Latin American camp, unfortunately, at this time, and that we still have a lot of work to do on the structural front. And I think we should be moving steadfastly in that area so that we could take advantage of any opportunities. So that's the short answer to it. I think we have the capacity, we have the capability, we have the people, knowledge, and the potential to ramp up our activity, our action in this area. But as I mentioned, legislation, institution, attitudes, technology, accountability, and all those sort of things, I think if we work on those things to get the way of doing business ramped up, I think we'll be well served in that regard. And the third one is on energy prices. Well, of course, I guess the other thing which I didn't mention about central bankers is that we tend to be very pessimistic and conservative and reserved, and I wouldn't say that we are averse to risk, but we prefer to be very conservative in our outlook. Last year when I spoke, I was talking about macroeconomic management in a time of uncertainty. And our perspective at the central bank is that we should treat the shock as permanent. And if you get something better, great, that is gravy. But if things turn out to be worse, then you're prepared. And furthermore, I think the lesson is that just the fact that we have to go through something like this wakes us up in certain regards, so that things that could have been taken for granted on the structural front could then be shored up then. So we could, as somebody said, you shouldn't waste, shouldn't waste what do you call it? Waste what? Shouldn't waste a crisis, something like that. So we have opportunities there. I do agree with you that things could go up, but do we want to build our hopes on that? I think it is better to be on the conservative side, but if oil prices go up, production go up, and so forth, then we would be. There's nothing to lose in that regard.
Good morning. Kyle Saunders from I-95.5. Now, I'm not sure if I may have misunderstood, but could you tell us exactly how much months of reserves do we actually have? And do you see that figure? Do you see that improving within the next year or in the next 3 years?
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
one
yeah,
of
yeah.
the question.
9.1? Uh,
And foreign, that's foreign reserves I'm speaking of.
yeah, yeah, 9.8 months. In terms of whether it would improve, well, on the present trajectory, it might actually weaken for a while, because if we have our intervention, what intervention meaning we spend, or the central bank intervenes bi-weekly. We've done it at a rhythm of about 150 US per month. With the current state of oil markets, we could have a further decline in reserves towards the end of this year, and especially if we have to increase intervention because of the seasonal Christmas things. So I would say in the next few months we might have a further slipping in reserves. I think they're still high and uncomfortable. Over the next period, it would depend clearly on what happens with energy prices, energy production, and demand. But in the short run, I would expect that it would slip slightly again.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Governor Hilaire, can you say how much U.S. currency the government needs on a monthly basis to repay its debts, to its foreign debts? And also, how does that affect the amount of foreign exchange then available to the market to give to sell to the central bank for businesses, the man on the street? Does that limit it in any such way?
Yeah, I don't have the actual numbers now, but our external debt is quite small. It is about 14% of GDP now. And the last big action was in 2016 when a $1 billion bond was raised. But the debt service does not, I mean, you have a certain amount of debt, but the debt service depends on the terms and conditions of borrowing. So the actual debt service is not substantial on a monthly basis, because you would have, as I said, our overall external debt is fairly small, and then if you had to pay all of it at the same time, that's a different matter. But it is clearly staggered. We would have the last bond was, I think, 10 years. So you have 10 years to pay that, and some of it is bullet and so forth. So it will be staggered over time. We would have multilateral financing, which tends to be drawn out. So the debt service profile, I don't think that is a particular problem now in terms of claims on the foreign reserves on a monthly basis. But we could provide the specifics later.
Sorry, if you can give a sense as well as to the lack of direct foreign investment, and how is that impacting the government's ability to get inflows of foreign exchange, and secondly, if you can also talk about, you talked about that there may be some capital projects going in order to increase, or to get some growth growing in the economy. Can you tell us whether in getting those capital projects going, that in itself may have an impact on the foreign exchange position because of the nature of the economy and the amount of imports that may be required, even in, say, some construction projects?
All right, let me start with the second question. I just want to put it in a context. To repeat the perspective I had, that given the fiscal situation now and the fiscal constraints, you have had some rollback in capital spending. So by itself, that would not add to growth, because most of the time, the capital projects are the ones that would be investments that would build for the future. So that's one of that's just the backdrop. Your specific question was on if you were to ramp up investment to build the capacity for growth, what would be the short-term and longer-term impact on the foreign exchange situation? Clearly, any project that we have to do in the country, especially capital projects, would require foreign exchange and other inputs. You have some labor, but you would have machinery, you would have maybe some technical stuff, some fancy materials that you have to get abroad. So you would have clearly some investment to make in that area, including using some of your foreign exchange for it. But of course, the benefit would be that to the extent that it is well considered, well planned, and well executed, then the dividends will pay for themselves over time. And this is a general point about any investment, that investments should be directed to high valued areas, because they are not supposed to be just money going down the drain. They are supposed to, which is different to current expenditure. You invest in something so that you would reap the rewards afterwards. So yes, but I wouldn't worry about that, because you would necessarily have to focus. And in fact, what you could end up doing is to prioritize either your foreign exchange or whatever your expenditures towards these high valued areas, with the realization that configuration would lead to growth in the future, including capacity to generate foreign currency. Now, depending on it, not all projects would be like that, but some may be like that. The first question about direct foreign investment, if I understand it clearly, you were suggesting that you may not have foreign investment, or
what I was saying is that there has been the amount of direct foreign investment in the country has certainly dwindled recently, and I'm asking whether or not the attraction of more DFI is really a route to go in an effort to, one, spur growth, and secondly, to increase or to ease some of the foreign exchange challenges that we may have.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I didn't understand the question. I would agree with that clearly. In other words, to the extent that you have anyone, whether it's local, foreign, extraterrestrial, wherever, they see the country as a good bet, as a place to do business. We have competition around the world for resources, for everything. We have to remain competitive. We have to have world standards and so forth. So to the extent that we are a good bet, then it would mean you could attract foreign investment. They would come because they see this is a good place to do business. Things are easy to do. They could reap rewards instead of going to some other country. And yes, I think you could have a lot of benefit from that. Of course, you have to be aware of the other sides of it, and not necessarily just be open to anything, but properly managed and in an open, transparent atmosphere. I think foreign investment could just be a good thing. And it could also help to stimulate the standards of your own local industry, because investors here also have the option of continuing to invest here or to invest abroad. So to the extent that we have high standards and we are a good place to do business, we have world-class professionals, we have things that are smooth, that are understandable and so forth, I think this would help a lot.
Good morning.
I can't help you with that.
Good morning. Joycelyn Francois from the Employers Consultative Association. I was just wondering, over the past probably way before my time, 40 years, we've been hearing
Way before.
way before, yes. Diversification, the whole issue of diversification. My question is really we know that we are oil-based, energy-based economy and all of that. Over the last probably 3 years, you're hearing a lot more again about diversification of the economy. So I was just kind of wondering whether the statistics and stuff that you would have been receiving give any indication that there is any real impact in the non-energy, in terms of the contribution from the non-energy sectors? Or are we still the same, in terms of the dependency on the energy sector? Are we seeing any difference from all the initiatives and all the talk and, different sectors that are being stimulated? Is that having any real impact?
All right. Well, when we look at the numbers, actually by default, the non-energy sector are having a larger place by default because the energy sector has been weakening a bit, or production has slowed or gone down. Then the proportions differ. So that the facts would show that. If you look at on any metric, the proportion of non-energy sectors to GDP, you've seen it going up. The proportion of non-energy revenue to government finances has gone up, to the balance of payments and so forth. So you see that default. But I think you were asking more on the conscious side. I don't know. I think there has been interest in other activities. We have not seen that much diversification so far. I think to the extent that we have a challenge now with our energy sector, this naturally would rekindle the spirits within us to do other things. We've seen some private sector businesses going abroad a lot more to Latin America, to other non-traditional areas, and so forth. I think there is a lot of potential excitement of going into other areas, partly because of necessity, and partly because I think we have it within us to explore and to be creative. So I would hope that we build on that and that we're able to advance. So in the short run, I think there are some other initiatives that are being planned. I would hope that they would bear fruit. And I think, but as I want to suggest, it might seem that I'm just repeating the same old mantra, but if you have, if you plan things to put, resources into different areas to diversify, as it were, it needs to be bolstered by proper macroeconomic policy, the right signals, and the right incentives and so forth. Otherwise, it would not be durable. You could just say, well, we will do this, we will do that, but it wouldn't be sustained, because after a while, people say, well, there's no point in it. So the signals have to be right. But let's keep the way of doing business at the forefront, all the structural reforms to make things better and stronger. And I think a lot of things will happen naturally.
Governor, I suppose I should get you to respond to the question being raised by the international agencies, a question issue by local business corporations, by economists. I even heard a former minister in the Ministry of Finance a couple mornings ago talking about it. This business of dealing with the exchange rate and allowing it to move given the circumstances. Your response to the question by Curtis about the reserves still being in a strong position, but if you go down 1 billion, 1.5 billion every year, sooner or later we're going to come to a crunch. And one argument is to staunch the flow, we have to do something with the exchange rate. I suppose that's what you talk about in your slide, the combination of fiscal and monetary policy working together. So that's a question from outside here. My question is,
So you're representing that,
yeah,
on behalf of the...
as a good reporter, I have to put to you to get your response. My question is an observation I made in the report, a small phrase, an observation that is in your report about crowding out the private sector from capital if the government gets involved, borrowing and so on. And I just wonder if that's just a theoretical economic phrase that has been thrown in there. And why I say so, because again, your data, not my doing, your data indicates quite clearly that the private sector is not going anywhere. The commercial lending is way down and falling all the time. Entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on, all of that is not seen in the economy. So, you know, again, Curtis talked about foreign direct investment. Do we have to sit and wait for that?
All right, thank you for bringing your question on behalf of the community. All right, you would have seen different reports, and I think including the latest IMF report. And the arguments for changing rates and so forth do have merit. Now, let me go back, and forgive me if it seems theoretical, but let me go back to a point I made about combination of policies and what could work and what may not work and so forth. Basically, any regime could work if you have the rest of the conditions supportive of that. Let me give 3 examples. One is a fixed exchange rate regime, completely fixed, either like the case of Barbados, which is an independent fix, or in the case of, let's say, Grenada or St. Vincent or Greece, in the context of a monetary union. You have adjustments to make. You say, well, all right, we are not using this instrument. Then we have to do more on the other fronts. It means that the fiscal situation may have to be more constrained and so forth, and you give up that. So that is possible to work. But it means that the other policies, the other balls that you're juggling, have to take that slack because you don't have those other levers. Let's take the other extreme of a completely flexible rate. The most easiest example would be like the reserve currency countries, let's say the US also. In that situation, the rate just equilibrates the market. It just goes by itself, so you don't have to worry about it. Demand, supply, all of that is taken care of in that situation. So that could work too, because they have agreed that this is how they would operate, and then the other policies follow suit. But of course, you have a lot of things in the middle, because I talk about fixed, I talk about flexible, and you have a whole range of possibilities. Let me think of one possibility. I think Dr. Farley may have mentioned it some time ago, of a crawling peg. What is a crawling peg? Crawling. What this could mean is that the country decides to adopt a rate that automatically changes based on certain indicators. One set of indicators, or one that may commonly be used, is the differential between the domestic inflation rate and the foreign inflation rate. And why would this be used? Because you say, well, if your inflation rate is higher than the rest, you'll be losing competitiveness, so you just change it and you get things back in order. This was pretty popular in Latin America. I remember Nicaragua used to do it, and in the 70s, 80s, and so forth. They call it deslizamiento in Spanish, with sliding and so. This has some benefit because it is automatic, so you don't have to be thinking about it. On the flip side, you could have some dynamics that end up being explosive, so that if you have your inflation rate always being higher than the rest, then the depreciation will continue. Then the markets may also say, well, the rate will decrease, or depreciate, so let me mark up my goods from upfront. So now expectations could take over, so the whole thing gets complicated and may not work if you don't have that. The point I'm making is that any regime could work if you have supportive fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural policy. It also needs to be bolstered by credibility, people have to believe it, and sustainability. So to answer your question, I think we have a toolkit before us that includes a number of instruments. We should keep everything open in the toolbox and be able to use whatever tool we feel appropriate at any time. But it needs to be coordinated with other policies. Otherwise, it just will not work. So this is my general take on that situation. In terms of the crowding out, this is an interesting area because, and I get back to and you rightly pointed out about if there's no demand for it, well, why, there's no crowding out because nobody wants the money anyway. But we do have a situation now, as we said, where the credit to businesses is very, very sluggish. And a part of it is because of the demand and because there may be some concern about this and that, so people are not ready to fully engage, or they may have other sources of financing also. When we talk about crowding out, it is more a potential situation. In other words, if, let's say, for example, and I'll use last year's situation and this year's situation, where you have the financing of the government budget. Last year you had a large part of it being financed by an external loan, which is the Eurobond. You were there. He raised some of the money. Right. So that means that there was less claim on domestic resources. In a situation now, to the extent that let's say the government is not borrowing externally, then a lot of the action would be on the domestic side. And potentially now, financial institutions or any other institution or individual will say, well, should I lend money to Jack or Jill or whoever, or should I lend it to the government? The government is gilt-edged, it will not default, and so forth. So this is a safe bet. And so therefore the potential is that banks' balance sheet or financial institutions' balance sheets could become dominated by government paper. So that's a potential. But I do agree with you that in a context where there may be less demand by the private sector, it may not matter that much, but it could pass a certain point because it could push up interest rates and they could then be sidetracked. So.
Carla had a question in the back. Judy Carla had a question, so it's right. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Carla Bridgewell from the Newsday. Governor, I beg your indulgence because I have a question that I'd like you to clarify. And I
Please.
may sound incoherent, but I'm a writer, not a public speaker. So I'm more articulate.
We'll
when
work it
I'm
out.
writing.
Don't worry.
Okay, the first thing I want you to clarify for me is who is responsible for setting the exchange rate? Is it the central bank? Is it a monetary policy or is it a fiscal policy? I just want to be clear on that,
Okay.
first of all. The second question is, now the argument against any sort of adjustment with the exchange rate is inflation, right? We don't want spiraling inflation. You've said that the inflation rate is relatively low. It's only 1.2%. So, is it really that bad if we adjust the adjust the exchange rate and cause some inflation? I mean, I'm certainly not an economist, but wouldn't that have some sort of income effect in terms of demand and supply?
I thought they say what an economist. Yeah, yeah.
I heard that term at some event, so I'm just. And the IMF report came out a couple days ago, and there are 3 points that it made. The first is that they urge the authorities to take steps to eliminate the imbalance in the foreign exchange market and improve competitiveness. They suggested a currency devaluation, which, if sufficiently large and introduced as well, I mean, obviously you've read this. If sufficiently large and introduced as part of a broader reform package, would help restore balance in the external position and in the foreign exchange market. And any adjustment to the exchange rate should be introduced as part of a broader fiscal and structural reform package. Now, you also mentioned that the central bank has taken a neutral policy stance. What is this neutral policy stance in context of the IMF suggestions? Is it that you all are ignoring the IMF suggestions? But yeah, what is the central bank, in the context of this, what is the central bank's stance? So those are the questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. For non-economists, putting us to shame. The first question, who is responsible? The exchange rate is a big price. It is the price at which a country's currency trades with the rest of the world. In no country would the public authorities, the fiscal authorities, and the government be not aware or not involved in the establishment of this price. In the case of Mexico, let me give you an example. They actually have a foreign exchange committee that looks at reserves, that looks at the exchange rate, and so forth, that is chaired by the Ministry of Finance. In other countries, you have different combinations and so. The long and short of it is that generally what happens is that the big questions on exchange rates are determined by the government in collaboration with the central banks, and then the day-to-day operations might then be worked out by the central bank. So, for example, when we would have had devaluations on the context of a fixed exchange rate in before 1993, we had it a couple of times. The Minister of Finance, the government, everybody was involved in that decision. Those are more stark examples because they had a major change in the rate. But also in the context of changes over time, depending on what's happening, people get involved. If you look at Japan, you look at China and so forth, when they talk about exchange rate issues, is the president, the prime minister, and this thing talking about it. When Mr. Trump talk about competitiveness and potentially Asian countries manipulating the currency, the president of the United States. So the point is that in a big price like that, the central bank is involved, but it is a larger issue among the authorities. Please.
Is it, the Ministry of Finance giving you all a directive?
Well, it will be worked out together. As I say, harmony or coordination of fiscal, monetary, and everything. So we are part of the world. We are part of the fraternity. We are consistent with the rest.
What the current discussions you've been having with the Ministry of Finance in determining whether or not you should adjust the exchange rate?
Well, we discuss all matters on a regular basis. We had a meeting up to yesterday. So we discuss all matters very frankly, very openly, including in all areas. These are closed door matters, so I wouldn't be able to go through that. And then whatever is determined is determined, and we go with it. The second issue on inflation, that's a very interesting question. And let me get back to a little theory, because since you are already familiar with the theory. But the argument is as follows, because they're different sides. That to the extent that you have, let's say you use the exchange rate adjustment, that because certain prices, domestic prices, are linked to the exchange rate because they're imported stuff and so forth, then this would then have an impact on the prices domestically, and then this could offset the benefit you're having. Now, there are 2 points you were raising. The first is, what is the level of the exchange, the inflation rate now? The numbers that we have show that they are very, very low. So this is not really related to what may happen if you have a currency change, but you're starting from a thing. What is more relevant might be what is the responsiveness to a change. What we have observed are a couple of things. The first is that there is a lag between changes in external prices, and we had Reshman company had done something on that. I think they had used external prices, maybe prices of international food or some kind of thing, on domestic prices. And what we saw is that it takes a few months for this to pass through. So that's the first thing, the lag effect. The second thing is the size of the response. Now, the size of the response is interesting. A lot depends on their starting position. To the extent that, let's say, profit margins are large or demand may be small, then you find that the pass-through effect may not be that significant initially. I mean, of course, things could change over time. But the point you did make is correct, that we would have to be concerned about potential impact on inflation, and that it is not just something that goes around and around in a circle, and you just defeat the purpose of it. The third point on the IMF report, well, actually, if you see, I have the report here, but I don't have the actual page. But in there, they do say that we are completely consistent with their, if you look at it, I don't have you have the page there? No. Anyway, we can find the page. But when they talk about monetary, let me start from broader. And yes, you did read it right, and maybe they saw our presentation before, but the combination of fiscal, monetary, and structural reform as a package, and as I was emphasizing to another question before, that you could have them in different orders or different combinations once they are consistent. The second point you're making now is about the neutral policy stance. And if you look at the part of the IMF report on monetary policy, they are completely in accord with what we are doing. The part on monetary policy, if you can find it. Yeah, the part on monetary policy says that the central bank is faced with a dilemma, that in a situation where the economy is undergoing some strain, where the economy is having some difficulty, that there is an argument for lowering interest rates, but in the context where you have foreign interest rates going up, then they support the central bank's monetary stance. So, I don't like to read things, but anyway, staff acknowledge that monetary policy considerations are finely balanced. This is page 17 of the report. And then without going through all the things, and then on the paragraph 29, on balance, staff supported the CBTT's policy of holding policy interest rates constant and avoiding signaling a bias in either direction. So, it's pretty clear when they were talking about that. So, but you could check it yourself and see. You're welcome.
Governor, in the IMF report, it said that market participants have indicated that foreign exchange transactions on the black market are becoming very common. Two questions. Are you aware of this situation? And also, is this situation likely to get worse if adjustments are not made to the exchange rate? And just a follow-up to Carla's question, you mentioned that you meet with the Ministry of Finance to deal with the holisticity of the exchange rate, and I know you're not privy to say what happens behind closed doors, but financial analysts and economists have argued that it appears as if it's a political decision by the government not to adjust the rate because they feel as if they will pay the price for it if prices do increase. Whereas on the other side, the business community is saying that their prices are not based on the exchange rate on the market right now. It's based on a higher rate. So if the rate is adjusted, I mean, will there really be any sort of repercussions as the government says?
What is the question? What's the second question? What question is? Or was that a comment or?
No, it is whether, and I don't know if you could comment on this. Is it the economists and financial analysts have argued that it appears as if it's a political decision by the government not to adjust the exchange rate? I wanted to get your views on that.
But let me start with that. I think you will have to ask, the relevant authorities. I'm not a politician, sorry, so I can't weigh in on that. On the black market thing, and the adjustments, I would just suggest that once you have a situation where there is any disequilibrium, and we know the situation now, then this creates incentives for people to find a way around it. And so in certain quarters, you could find something like that happening. So it is not unusual. I don't think it's extreme, but of course, as we also suggested, that we need to sort things out. The sooner we have a combination of policies that creates the balance, then these things naturally tend to dissipate. They are not independent of the situation. They are born out of a certain imbalance, and to the extent that, so our focus, I think, as a country would be to address the nature of the imbalance, and then some of these symptoms would then naturally fall away.
If I could just put Julie's question a little different way. Would you say that you've talked about there being good and bad reasons for the exchange rate to be allowed to depreciate? Would you say that one of the reasons that is stopping the central bank and the government from, in fact, allowing it to depreciate has to do with the potential fallout politically that it may have for the government should there be increased prices? In other words, from the perspective of the central bank, would you say that you think that in fact the exchange rate should be allowed to depreciate, but bearing in mind your relationship with the government and so on, that they may not be so inclined because of the potential political fallout?
Well, I think it's the same question. So I will have the same answer, but I'll probably put it in a different way since you asked it. No, but I think as I want to emphasize, it is important to look at everything holistically, and to be able to use all our instruments at our command. We know the situation. We know the broad perspective. We know that we could have oil prices going up. We know that we could have things just falling into place like that. As a central bank, as I said, we tend to be looking at things very, ascetically and very clinically and in a conservative fashion, because we think this is the prudent course. And this is how we see it. So.
In a non-Greenspan-like answer.
If you didn't understand me. but the same thing. I mean, I mentioned the different possibilities that anything could work once they are coordinated, once they are well managed, once they are coherent, and once they are consistent.
All right, so we take two more questions.
Okay, Governor, I am leaving here a little. I'm not sure what word to use. I'm hearing from your voice and what you have said, a sense of urgency, that some things need to be done urgently. You spoke about the structural adjustment. You spoke about things like legal, legislation and all of that. That takes time. So my concern is, are you optimistic that some of those things that need to be done and that we know take time, given the urgency of your message to us, are you optimistic that we will not fall deeper into a crisis? I don't know if that's a fair question, but I just want to feel a little more comfortable when I go back to talk to my employers, the employer community. Optimism or pessimism, given the context of the time that is required. You talked about attitudes, you talked about changes. That's a whole, do we have the time for that? Recently, we were at the ICAT seminar, and, former deputy governor spoke about the need for a deep dive. Yeah, it's not business as usual and all of that. Do we have the time to put all of those things in place so that we could be optimistic? Or do I leave here kind of shoulders
Well,
down?
I wouldn't want to have responsibility for your mood when you leave here. So I had to be a bit humble in my expectations. But time is relative. In working in different countries, I have observed that, say, well, this will take time. But when you have something, when you're back against the wall, it happens, eh? And people make adjustments, either because they realize it on their own, that, listen, it's a eureka moment or whatever, some epiphany or so, or they have no choice. And you wouldn't believe the adjustments we all make in our personal circumstances when you have to, or when you determine that it is important to do it. I don't think a lot of things should necessarily take forever. And you could start anywhere, and you could push with the right approach and get, I think there's a tremendous amount that could be done. I mean, I like to give the example of, you go to the US, and most of you will be traveling to the US. And every time you go, it's a different thing now. First of all, you had to have a form, 2 forms, then you didn't have one form, and then you could use a photo, you put your hand there, and now you could go to some kiosk. Now, each of these things are adaptations to situations that they are found, whether it is a security situation or whatever. And each time they have to make some change, they have to probably get trainers, the officers, they have to get new equipment and so forth, but they're adapting. You come back to Trinidad and you have this long form, and you have to put your address, and then you have to put your address of where you're staying. You are national, but you have to put that again. Then you have to put, are you married? Then you have to put, do you need all of this thing? We've been doing this all the time. Couldn't this be changed? I mean, somebody has to print this form, somebody had to collate it, somebody had to check it. Do we need it? Can't we just change that? I think there's a tremendous potential for adjustment once we put our minds to it, and it will happen. So I am optimistic in that sense. I don't know if that will change your mood, but I am optimistic. I think we have the capacity once we focus, and there's a tremendous set of dividends that we could reap from doing that.
Good morning, Janine Brown, CNMG. We spoke a lot this morning about the strengthening of policy, Governor, and you highlighted some of the factors for consideration to basically take us from where we are to where we need to be or closer. Technology legislation as examples. On the focusing particularly on legislation, as Governor, is there any introduction or amendment to legislation that you are in a position to say that you're proposing or that you think needs to be implemented? Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that now. So we have some people from our supervision department that excited as you give me this opening. but, but clearly we have the insurance legislation that we want to sort out. It has been going on for forever. I think a lot of great work has been done on all sides of Parliament, and we are ready to move, and we want to get this thing sorted out. We are gearing up at the central bank to be able to be ready for a world where we have to do more risk-based insurance supervision, but we need to get that sorted out. So that is one thing that I would advocate very strongly. Other areas include, on the payment side, electronic banking, I think, for government payments, that the government, I think there are some roadblocks to government using electronic forms of payment because of the legislation. I think we could do that, and that would have a lot of potential for us to move forward. And of course, we have, on the other side, some issues to be sorted out still on the tax issues, the FATCA, not FATCA, but the other things that we need to get to move us to a different standard. But certainly on the financial side, I don't want to focus on too much things, but I want to get the insurance stuff passed in a hurry. So thanks for raising that question.
Thank you very much for your very rich engagement. We really appreciate it, and we like to see the governor tested. So thank you very much for coming and for sharing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I also just want to recognize the departments who really are devoted and committed to excellence, and the persons who are research department, external relations, the support services departments, because without them, we really could not present to you as we did this morning. And I want to thank them very much. You didn't test Garnet, next time, right? Thank you for coming. We've kept you long. We have refreshments. So please feel free as you go through those doors to sit and have something before you leave. And all the best. God's riches.